I knew I was in trouble the second I saw Deborah Grimley, the HOA president, stomping across my front lawn in her floral sun hat and wedge heels, gripping a clipboard like it was a weapon. I was halfway through changing my oil in the driveway, grease on my hands and all, when she stopped dead in front of my newly installed mailbox. "That's not approved," she snapped, stabbing her pen at it like it had committed a felony. "Isaiah, you can't just install whatever you want. This mailbox violates HOA aesthetic standards." I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on a rag, and stared at the black, powder-coated steel mailbox I'd installed 2 days ago. It was sleek, sturdy, and locked exactly what I'd wanted after someone tried mail theft on my street last month. "It's USP standard," I replied. "I double-checked before I bought it." "Well, it's not HOA standard," she huffed, flipping her clipboard to a page filled with highlighted paragraphs and sticky notes. "All exterior fixtures must be pre-approved by the architectural committee." "You didn't submit a request. That's a violation," I crossed my arms. "Deborah, it's a mailbox, not a gazebo. You're telling me I need written permission to receive my mail?" She gave me a tight-lipped smile. "There are rules for a reason. You'll be receiving a fine in the mail." Irony must have been lost on her. Sure enough, 2 days later, a letter showed up delivered right into the very same mailbox she claimed wasn't allowed. It was a formal notice from the HOA fining me $250 for unauthorized structure installation. They gave me 10 days to remove it or face escalating fees and a lien on my home. I wasn't about to let that happen, so I spent the next few days digging. I pulled the USPS regulations, the HOA's own bylaws, and every architectural guideline they'd emailed out in the past 5 years, and I found some interesting stuff. For one, there was no mention of mailboxes needing approval unless they were custom-built or non-compliant with federal standards. Mine was a mass-produced model listed on the USPS's official compliance list, so either Deborah didn't read her own rules, or she just didn't care. 3 days before the removal deadline, I walked into the next HOA board meeting, copy of the USPS mailbox design standards in one hand and a printed photo of my installed box in the other. Deborah was already seated at the head of the table, sipping from her lemon water like she owned the neighborhood. "Isaiah," she said without looking up, "if you're here to appeal that fine, I wouldn't waste your time." "The board already, I'm not here to appeal," I said, sliding the documents across the table. "I'm here to prove you're wrong." That got her attention. Deborah's eyes narrowed as she glanced over the documents I slid toward her. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the overhead fan and the occasional shuffle of paper. The other board members, John, Carol, and a newer guy named Lewis, watched with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. My presence wasn't exactly routine. Most residents didn't show up to these meetings unless they needed something. "I see you've done your research," Deborah muttered, tapping her pen against the table's edge. She didn't touch the papers. I pointed to the highlighted section of the USP standards. "Right there. It specifies the dimensions, mounting height, and construction. Every single line matches the box I installed. You'll find the product model on the compliance list. It's a federally approved design." Carol leaned forward, squinting at the page. "This does look official." "Where did you get it?" "Directly from the USPS website. Took all of 5 minutes." Lewis reached for the photo. "And this is the actual mailbox," I nodded once. "Installed 3 feet from the curb, heights within regulation, and it locks like it's supposed to." "There's nothing custom about it." Deborah didn't look up. "We still have design standards. Visual cohesion matters. It doesn't match the others on the street." I stepped back, folding my arms. "That's not what the guidelines say. I've read every page. There's no mention of required color, brand, or style for mailboxes unless it's a deviation from federal standards, which this isn't. You're enforcing a rule that doesn't exist." John cleared his throat. "Deb, is that true?" "Have we updated the mailbox guidelines recently?" She waved a hand without answering. "This isn't just about a mailbox, it's about precedent. If we let this slide, next thing you know someone's putting up an aluminum flamingo sculpture at the curb." "That's not how this works," I said firmly. "You can't invent violations to keep control. I followed the law. That should be the end of it." There was a pause. Even Lewis seemed uneasy now. He rubbed the back of his neck and muttered, "We should probably consult the association attorney before escalating further." Deborah's tone sharpened. "We don't need legal counsel to enforce basic community standards. A legal threat over a federally approved mailbox isn't basic," I shot back. "It's harassment." Carol looked between us, then finally said what no one else had. "Maybe we acted too fast." "If there's no specific rule against this kind of mailbox, then issuing a fine wasn't justified." John nodded slowly. "We don't want to open ourselves to liability, Deborah." She clamped her jaw shut and stared at the table, but I wasn't done. "There's something else," I said, pulling another document from my folder. "I filed a FOIA request with the city planning office. Got it back yesterday." Lewis blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to know how often the HOA submits formal documentation for architectural violations." I laid down the sheet showing an empty record for the last 2 years. "Not once." "Which means either you're not reporting violations properly or you're selectively enforcing them." That finally got a reaction from Deborah. She sat up straighter, her grip tightening on the pen. "You're accusing us of misconduct. I'm saying this board has no paper trail of its enforcement actions, which is a legal requirement in this county. And I've already forwarded this to the city's compliance office." John paled slightly. "Wait, you went to the city? They're the only ones who can enforce administrative oversight. And if this board is issuing fines with no documentation and no due process, that's a serious problem." Lewis turned to Deborah. "Is this true? Are we supposed to be submitting these actions to the city?" She didn't answer. The silence in the room stretched. I could tell the weight of it was starting to crack the surface of their little operation. These people weren't used to being challenged, not with facts. Not with city oversight looming over their shoulders. Then, from the far end of the table, Carol quietly asked, "How many fines have we issued this year, Deb?" Deborah still didn't respond. I answered for her. 17. I pulled the HOA financial reports. That's nearly $5,000 in fines, most of which were issued without warning letters or hearings. I've already contacted 3 other homeowners who are willing to testify. Lewis looked alarmed now. Testify to what? To the fact that this HOA has been operating outside its charter. Issuing penalties with no due process. No hearings, no written explanations, just notices taped to doors and threats of liens. That's illegal. John ran a hand down his face. "If this is true, we're in serious trouble." "We?" I asked. "Or her?" Deborah finally slammed her pen down. "Enough. This is a volunteer board. We do our best to keep this neighborhood in order, and now you want to drag us through the mud over a mailbox." "No," I said. "You did that to yourself. You picked the wrong homeowner to bully." Carol stood up. "I move that we rescind the fine immediately." "I second," Lewis said quickly. John didn't hesitate. "All in favor?" Hands went up. Deborah's stayed down. I turned and started gathering my papers, but just before I left, I said one last thing. "I'm not finished. I've already filed a formal complaint with the County Property Oversight Division. They're opening an investigation into how this board has been handling its authority." John looked stunned. "You already did that 3 days ago." As I walked out of the room, I heard Carol mutter, "We need emergency legal counsel." The next morning, a letter arrived again, straight into the same mailbox Deborah tried to outlaw. It was a formal retraction of the fine, signed by all board members except her. It also included a note stating that any future enforcement actions would be accompanied by written justification and an appeal process. But the fallout was just beginning. Within a week, a city inspector showed up at Deborah's house. Turns out, she'd been doing a bit of unauthorized construction herself, a backyard deck expansion that extended past her property line into the greenbelt. No permits, no approvals, and worst of all, she'd used HOA funds to pay the contractor under the guise of community landscaping improvements. The city froze the HOA's accounts pending a full audit. I didn't need to lift another finger. The residents did the rest. People started showing up to meetings. Quiet families who'd never spoken up before brought documents, pictures, and receipts. They shared stories of intimidation, unapproved fines, and threats of foreclosure. Deborah tried to defend herself, but the more she spoke, the more she sank. By the next month's vote, she was out. Lewis was elected president with a unanimous vote. Carol stayed on, but John stepped down, citing stress and a desire to spend more time with his grandchildren. No one blamed him. As for me, I didn't run for the board. I didn't need to. I'd already done what I came to do. The mailbox stayed untouched. But more importantly, the community had changed. People talked to each other now. They shared updates, watched out for each other, and made sure no one pushed them around anymore. All because one woman thought she could fabricate a problem and get away with it. She didn't count on someone reading the rules better than she did. The day after Deborah was officially removed from the board, I found a folded note wedged under my windshield wiper. It was typed, unsigned, and brief. "You may have won the battle, but you've made enemies. Watch your back." I read it twice, then walked inside, locked the door, and pulled up my security camera footage. I'd installed a full perimeter system months ago, not because I expected trouble, but because I liked knowing what was going on around my property. This time, though, it served a very different purpose. At exactly 2:47 a.m., a shadow crossed my driveway. The figure was tall, slim, and wore a hoodie pulled low. They didn't look at the camera, but they limped slightly on the right leg. I zoomed in. The person approached my truck, slipped the note under the wiper, then walked off toward the cul-de-sac. The footage wasn't great, but it gave me enough. I made 2 copies and sent one to the new HOA president, Lewis, with a short message asking if he could identify anyone in the neighborhood who walked with a limp. The other copy went to Officer Kelly at the community precinct. I'd spoken to her before about noise complaints during 4th of July, and she'd always been straight with me. She called back that afternoon. "You've got reason to be concerned," she said. "We've had 2 other residents report anonymous threats this week. Both were folks who filed complaints against the previous board. One had her garden dug up. The other had their porch light shot out with a pellet gun." "When did this start?" "Right after the audit was announced." "Looks like someone's trying to scare people into silence." I leaned back in my chair. "Is it Deborah? We don't have proof of that, yet." The word hung in the air like a loaded pistol. That night, I hosted a small gathering at my place, nothing big, just a few neighbors who'd been at recent meetings. They brought folding chairs, we grilled burgers, and we talked, not about the mailbox or Deborah, but about what came next. "We need to go through those financial records," said Tom, a retired accountant who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built. "If she used HOA funds for personal projects, that's embezzlement." "No if about it," replied Deanne, a former paralegal. I found 3 invoices marked landscape restoration with no matching work order, no contractor info, and no receipts. The checks were signed by her alone. Lewis arrived around 7. He looked tired but determined. The city's audit team found discrepancies in last year's annual report. Over $17,000 unaccounted for. They're freezing all non-essential HOA spending until an internal review is complete. "What happens if they find criminal activity?" I asked. "They already did." He handed me a copy of the initial findings. Included was a flagged transaction for a community beautification project totaling over $8,000 money that had been routed through a shell landscaping company registered under the name DGS Improvements. "DGS," said Deanne. "Her initials." "Exactly," Lewis said. "The company doesn't exist as a licensed business. It's a ghost entity set up to funnel HOA payments into a personal bank account. The city referred the case to the county fraud unit this morning. That explained the threats." By the weekend, uniformed officers escorted a forensic accounting team into the HOA office. It was a converted pool house behind the tennis courts, and for the first time in years, the windows weren't fogged with gossip or petty power plays. They were filled with evidence boxes. I kept my distance, but I saw Deborah once storming out of her house with a duffel bag, her phone pressed to her ear. She didn't look at me. If she had, she would have seen a man watching, not gloating. The next day, I was subpoenaed. I arrived at the county courthouse nervous but prepared. The investigator, a woman named Carla with a firm handshake and no time for nonsense, led me into a small conference room where 2 other residents were already waiting. She laid out the process and showed us documents we'd already seen: false invoices, duplicate checks, and internal emails Deborah had failed to delete from the HOA server. She used her personal email for official communication, Carla said. Sloppy but convenient for us. I wasn't sure what to say. She also kept handwritten notes, Carla added, sliding a yellow legal pad across the table, including a list titled Residents to Control, your names at the top. Tom leaned forward. What does that mean, in context? Likely a list of people she considered threats to her authority. There are notes next to each name. Watch Mailbox, check for violations, pressure into compliance. Sounds like organized harassment, I said. It is. And it's going to be part of the case. The charges filed against Deborah included embezzlement, fraud, misuse of public funds, criminal harassment, and obstruction of a municipal audit. She was arrested 2 days later in her driveway, still in her slippers. Word spread fast. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had transformed. The HOA office was temporarily handed over to a city-appointed trustee, and Lewis worked with a transition team to rebuild the board from scratch. They added bylaws requiring third-party oversight for all financial decisions, mandatory publication of meeting minutes, and quarterly open forums where residents could raise concerns without fear of retaliation. But change wasn't just procedural. It was personal. One evening, I was walking my dog when I saw Mr. Haverson, the grumpy guy from 3 doors down, planting flowers along the sidewalk. He'd never spoken more than a grunt in 5 years. This time he waved. Mailbox looks good, he said. Thanks, I replied, surprised. He jabbed the soil with a trowel. Used to think you were a troublemaker. Now I think you just woke everyone up. It hit me then how deep the silence had sunk, how much we'd all tolerated just to avoid conflict. Deborah had counted on that silence. She'd built her power on it, but it was gone now. A few weeks later, the city held a public hearing on HOA reform policy, and Lewis asked me to speak. I didn't want to at first, but then I looked around at the people who'd shown up, the same ones who once kept their heads down, now sitting up straight. So I stood before the panel and told them the truth. That it started with a mailbox, but it ended with a community standing up. That all it took was someone reading the fine print and refusing to be intimidated. That local power, when unchecked, can become dangerous, but also that accountability begins with one voice saying, "No more." They listened. And when I sat down, the room applauded not for me, but for what we'd become, not just neighbors, a community. The trial began mid-October under a slate-colored sky that matched the tension in the courthouse's public gallery. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution table, flanked by neighbors who, like me, had once kept their heads down during board meetings and now leaned forward with quiet resolve. The charges stacked against Deborah grimly had expanded since the initial investigation: wire fraud, tampering with financial records, and witness intimidation were now part of the list. Deputy District Attorney Corrine Messer, a sharp-jawed woman with a calm but cutting courtroom presence, opened with a statement that left no room for doubt. This case, she said, is about a woman who used her position of trust to manipulate, threaten, and steal from the very people she was supposed to serve. Deborah sat at the defense table, her blazer stiff as armor, jaw clenched. Her attorney, a private litigator known for dragging out civil cases until his opponents ran out of resources, kept glancing at her like he was waiting for her to blink first. The prosecution's first witness was Lewis. He brought with him a stack of internal memos and audio recordings from the transition meetings, where Deborah had allegedly tried to broker silence in exchange for clean exits for certain board members. She told me, Lewis said, voice steady, that if we shredded the last 2 years' worth of financial notes, there wouldn't be anything left for the city to dig up. Corrine asked, did she make that statement under the assumption that you'd help her hide evidence? Lewis nodded. She said I'd be rewarded, that a loyal successor would always find a comfortable seat. Gasps rippled softly through the gallery. I sat still, watching Deborah's knuckles go pale around the arms of her chair. Next came Deanne, who testified about the fake landscaping company and the bogus checks Deborah had pushed through the HOA account. She created DGS improvements using a P.O. box registered to a vacant lot, Deanne explained. The checks were deposited into an account linked to her cousin, who hadn't lived in the state for over a decade. We tracked the money to a personal savings account under Deborah's name. Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. The evidence spoke loudly enough. I was called to the stand on day 3. Corrine walked me through the beginning, how I'd been fined, how I'd researched the USPS guidelines, and how I'd discovered the HOA's enforcement irregularities. Then she turned to the heart of it. Mr. Isaacs, what prompted you to investigate further once your fine was rescinded? I kept my tone measured. I realized that if they were willing to fabricate a violation that didn't exist, it probably wasn't the first time. And it wouldn't be the last unless someone did something. Did you feel threatened during this process? Yes, I received an anonymous note, and my security footage showed someone approaching my property in the early morning hours. I turned that over to the precinct. She nodded. And what did you find in the HOA's documentation that raised red flags? I handed her the summary. I'd prepared an index of board meeting minutes with missing dates, financial reports with no verifiable expenses, and a list of residents who had been fined repeatedly without a single formal violation notice or hearing. Corrine held the document aloft. This, she said to the judge, represents 2 years of unchecked abuse of authority. Deborah's defense tried to claim miscommunication, clerical errors, and overzealous enforcement, but every claim unraveled under cross-examination. When her cousin was subpoenaed and failed to appear, the court issued a bench warrant. His absence was taken as an implied admission. The turning point came when the forensic accountant, an expert retained by the city, testified about the digital audit trail. Miss Grimley deleted over 80 documents from the HOA server, he said, but didn't realize the server had an automatic backup protocol. We recovered every single one. Several of those files contain detailed plans to redirect HOA funds to personal accounts, including instructions for falsifying invoices. The final blow came in the form of a voice recording between Deborah and a former board member who had turned witness after being threatened with legal action. If you say anything about the deck, Deborah was heard saying, I'll make sure your property gets reassessed and your dues triple. I know how to make problems for people. That was it. The judge called a recess before returning with his ruling. Deborah Grimley was found guilty on all counts. The sentence: 8 years in state prison, restitution of over $27,000 to the HOA, and a permanent ban from holding any position of governance within a registered community association. Outside the courthouse, cameras from the local news station caught residents hugging, shaking hands, and exchanging quiet congratulations. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of victory. It was a release, like a pressure valve finally opening after years of tight-lipped fear. Lewis approached me on the courthouse steps, holding a folder. We're launching a neighborhood oversight council, he said. Not just to monitor the HOA, but to make sure this never happens again. We've got volunteers and we want you to chair it. I shook my head. I'm not really the committee type, he smiled slightly. You don't have to be, you just have to keep asking the right questions. I agreed on one condition: open updates to all residents, quarterly reports posted publicly, and a rotating leadership structure so no one person held power too long. Lewis agreed without hesitation. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to shift. Not in dramatic ways, but in small, steady movements. The HOA bylaws were rewritten with legal consultation to include safeguards, mandatory double signatures for expenditures, third-party audits every year, and a resident-elected panel to review any proposed fines before they were issued. The mailbox that started it all. Still there. And now, several homes had similar versions installed. No one asked for approval. They didn't need to anymore. The most surprising transformation came from the people. Families who used to avoid eye contact at the mailbox now chatted during morning walks. Neighbors helped each other with painting projects, watched over pets during vacations, and organized monthly block dinners. One Saturday, I hosted a barbecue. Tom brought his famous chili, Deanne brought her husband, and Lewis brought a binder of updates he never once opened. We sat under string lights in my backyard, the air warm with the scent of grilled corn and cedar mulch. A little girl from down the block ran through the yard chasing a bubble wand. Her father, a construction worker who'd once been fined for leaving a ladder against his garage, waved at me from the lawn chair. He raised his drink. To the guy who read the rules, I raised mine back. To the community that decided they mattered. No one said Deborah's name that night. No one had to. Her chapter was over. What followed was something entirely different, a neighborhood that had found its voice and wasn't giving it up again, and all because someone tried to tell me my mailbox didn't belong.